Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 216 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. Today I have with me Bob Appleton. Bob is a partner at the law firm of Day & Pitney in New York City. Bob is a longtime practitioner in the anti-corruption and anti-bribery field, having worked at several NGOs in his career. And today he talks to us about the real cost of corruption on the ground. He talks about some mosquito nets in Burkina Faso that the procurement by the government involved corruption and what the real costs were. Many people think of corruption as a victimless crime. Bob talks to us about how that's really not true. There are victims. The episode comes in at just over 24 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I have with me Bob Appleton. Bob is a partner at the law firm of Day Pitney in New York, but he has a great and varied background in the global fight against corruption. And he wrote an article in the FCPA blog earlier this month that really caught my eye, and I asked him if he could visit with us about his article, the blog post, the case, and really some of his thoughts about the cost of corruption. So he's agreed to take some time to visit with us today. And with that somewhat long-winded introduction, Bob, thanks a lot for taking the time to visit with me.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here, and very welcome the opportunity to talk with you.
You wrote a blog post entitled "Bednets, Burkina Faso, and the Devastating Cost of Corruption," where you talked about an investigation that you were involved in around corrupt procurement by the Burkina Faso government. But the thing that really struck me about the article was you talked about the effects of corruption on the ground. So maybe with that, you could just kind of walk us through the underlying facts that led you to post the blog or write the blog.
Sure, absolutely, and thanks again for the opportunity. So let me maybe set the stage a little bit for you and the audience. This has been going on since for several years, but started in about 2010. And in 2010, I was the head of investigations for the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, which is actually the world's largest insurer of health grants in the world, and in fact really underlies many of the governments in the developing world, their health and medical and ministries, and in fact one of the largest donors to many of the developing governments. One of them was Burkina Faso, and the Global Fund was a big supporter of the government, as well as all the health products and issues there. As the Burkina Faso, which many of the listeners might not know, is plagued by issues of AIDS and TB and malaria, and one of the poorest countries in the world. And the Global Fund had actually supported health grants into the country for some time, and also their anti-malaria campaign. And one of the things that they did was ensure and also provide funds for the country to get anti-malaria nets for their population. And so the way it typically works is the fund provides the funding directly to the government, and the government really is responsible for the procurements. And in this case, the government undertook the procurement, but a relative of the very high-ranking government official was the one that handled the procurement exercise, and ended up steering the contract to a favored company. And that company then outsourced the production of these anti-malaria nets to a entity in China. Well, the first problem, of course, is the fact that the procurement exercise was steered, and as you identify it, there's a corruption there. But the worst part of this whole thing was the fact that Chinese company, when it went to perform, ended up providing more than 2 million nets to the country that had absolutely no insecticidal treatment. So the way these long-lasting insecticidal nets work is they're actually a net that folks in the country, the population sleeps under, and it's typically a quality product has a layering of a medicinal component that attaches to the top of the net that repels and actually kills the mosquitoes. So it provides the most protection of the net itself, and it's without that treatment, the net is really much less significant in the fight to combat the mosquitoes and malaria-carrying mosquitoes. So in this case, actually, the case was first identified, or the problem was first identified by the victim company, because what happened was the Chinese manufacturer had actually mimicked in the packaging of an actual other bidder, another manufacturer, and it was the quality, not if that's the right word, but the packaging simulation was so good, the naked eye, you could not tell the difference between the packaging that the counterfeiter produced and the real company. And so this country, the country Burkina Faso, received 2 million of these substandard nets and essentially distributed them throughout the country. And so these nets were actually in place for many months before the problem was discovered, and it came to our attention first when the whistleblower contacted the hotline. We were based actually in Geneva, Switzerland at the time, and we received this complaint, and quite stunningly, the company, the victim company, had actually gone to China. One of their agents had gone to China and actually taken a video of the counterfeit company with the nets in hand, went right up to the company's gates and filmed a worker actually showing off one of these counterfeited packaging and nets. So anyway, we, of course, launched an investigation, and it led to an identification of this corrupt procurement exercise. And of course, in these cases, it's always a quandary what you do, but we felt we had to disclose, even before the investigation was done, what we had found. As we went in country and we sampled these nets, and we learned that all of them had not been treated with the medicinal layering and the protected covering. And so we knew we had a real problem on our hands, and so we went back to our secretariat and notified them of the problem midstream, even though we risked, the investigation running its logical course and identifying all the responsible parties. We felt the health risk was so significant we had to do it, and we did do that. And to its credit, the fund quickly sprang into action and went in country themselves, and the grant management folks engaged with the in-country personnel and did quite a massive campaign to replace all the nets that had gone in country. Now, the cost of this was phenomenal, and for a country like Burkina Faso, I think the cost was between 15 and 20 million to replace just the nets themselves, and not to mention, and not taking into account the redelivery and going around to the remote locations where all these nets were distributed. Burkina Faso is actually a rather large country. So this meant going out to all the regions and advising people that they may be sleeping under a net that has no protection. So as you can imagine, there was quite a lot of panic and concern in the communities and amongst the populace of the country that they were perhaps being infected by malaria when they thought they were being protected with this product. Unfortunately, I think we only had a handful of actual malaria instances or infections as a result of the deficiency in the products, and we didn't. I don't think we had any. I don't believe we had any deaths, but nonetheless, the risk to the entire country and the population was extraordinary, and it was all as a result of this corrupt procurement and the fact that this company was gained this contract through corrupt means and was able to get it steered. And the scary part of these kinds of things is that when you have a bidder or a company who wins a contract through fraud or corruption, then you never you're sometimes risk not having oversight and being able to confirm what they're delivering is in fact, quality product. In this case, it wasn't. And to make, add insult to injury, the company that was counterfeited, the actual company that does make a quality net, ended up, I believe, going out of business because of the loss of this and other contracts. It's a pretty competitive field. And so this is, I think a great example of why I was kind of motivated to write about it. It's a great example of how hear a lot about, well, what are the real costs of corruption? I mean, it doesn't really, translate into, perhaps only translate into economic, issues or losses. But here you had real live health consequences as a result of what happened. And so it's, this is, I think, a great illustration of the dangers of what corruption can do to actual the lives of folks that are the victims of this.
Absolutely. And that's really one of the things that struck me about your article, that I fight that argument every day that corruption is a victimless crime, and it's really just $2 billion corporations kind of slugging it out in the economic world over the right to have a contract. And in many cases, that's not true at all. And so you spoke about, obviously, the effects on the ground with the population, but also the legitimate company that was also defrauded and had to go out of business. So really the costs of corruption are much wider and broader than I think many business people think about.
I think that's absolutely right, Tom. No question. And I think this kind of a case is a good illustration of it. And I would also note that it was not an anomaly. I mean, we were actually coming across these kinds of things quite a lot. We did a lot of deep investigations in through that area of the African continent, namely the Francophone countries of West Africa and Burkina Faso and Mali and Mauritania. And we were finding similar issues throughout the region, not just in the bed net industry, but also in the regular administration of the health grants. We saw quite a lot of loss and diversion in the contracts, and you had companies that didn't think twice, that weren't concerned about the health ramifications. I mean, these grants are intended to benefit the sick, children, folks, people living with AIDS, to promote and to support medical treatment in hospitals. And we were finding quite a lot of these funds were being diverted and actually outright being stolen, but usually through corruption in the procurement process, or in false invoicing for contracts. And so there was a lot of it that I was quite surprised about the lack of concern for the intended beneficiaries and how real people were getting hurt, because these funds are supposed to be used to promote health and well-being, and they weren't reaching those purposes.
What was the government's response when you were able to bring this information to them? You touched upon what they did in terms of the replacement. In terms of bringing the evidence and indices of corruption to them, how did you find their response?
Well, I think the problem here was that we had evidence and information that senior people in the government were involved in the corruption and the procurement, so we had a bit of a problem there. Obviously they did act properly and supportively with respect to replacing. They didn't pose any problem or objection to replacing the nets. In fact, supported us in our effort to do that, but weren't so. They had to cooperate with respect to the investigation into the circumstances of the procurement, but because we had issues surrounding government participation, or at least connections to the government who were participating, we had a bit of a problem with getting kind of accountability and full cooperation with respect to that aspect of the case. But at least on the health, the health aspect, we were able to replace the nets with little opposition.
Bob, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've had a career in the global fight against corruption, but now could you tell us about what you do at Day Pitney and what's your current practice?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Well, I've done a bit of an about-face, well, at least a little bit of a different direction. I mean, I started out my career as a assistant U.S. attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice and spent 13 years in the DOJ prosecuting U.S. criminal violations of corruption in the U.S., but also I was doing a fair amount of international sanctions, weapons cases, international money laundering work. And then in 2005, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to join Paul Volcker's Independent Inquiry Committee investigation into the Iraqi oil for food scandal, which I think today is still one of the largest, if not the largest, corruption case yet, with how Saddam Hussein was able to bilk $1.8 billion out of the UN relief sanctions program that they allowed him to sell oil and buy food supplies and I got a reprieve from the sanctions. And of course, as everyone knows, I mean, that was corrupted pretty extensively. So I worked on that for a year, and then the commission ended its work, and the UN asked me in 2006 to head their first anti-corruption unit, and so I did that for 3 years. We had a staff of more than 50 from around the world, investigators, lawyers, and forensic folks, and I think we did about more than 350 investigations, corruption investigations. And then in 2010, I went to the Global Fund, which I just talked about. I was there for 4 years. So I came back to the U.S. in June of 2014 and joined Day Pitney, and so now it's after 20+ years in the field of investigating corruption. I'm now advising and counseling companies on compliance, doing anti-corruption training, and also got a few defense cases where the companies or individuals are subjects of both U.S. and foreign government corruption investigations. So it's a bit of a different direction now, Tom, from what I have been doing, but I find it equally as challenging. Also, fulfilling, kind of addressing corruption issues from within rather than externally as part of an investigation unit. So I find it incredible. I'm also able to see from the firsthand how companies are addressing these issues. Especially, it's quite a significant time with many of these very interesting opinions and decisions coming out, and you've got the Yates memo and all these other policies now that are so focused on corruption. I remember when I started out, I think in the 90s, the FCPA and corruption didn't have as high a profile. It wasn't as one of the more significant areas for government investigation, and now it's a much higher priority, and you see the spike in cases that are being brought under the FCPA and other statutes, and you see the FIFA case, and so it's very it's a very interesting time to be still involved in this, and it's been fortunate to be able to stay involved through a little bit of a different angle.
One of the things that I try to talk about is that there are business solutions to a lot of these problems. So I say that anti-corruption compliance is a business solution to the legal problem of complying with the FCPA. But it seems like to me that that may work in a lot of other areas like human trafficking, like slavery, like money laundering, and other areas that have their own compliance field. Have you seen corporations begin to respond to that type of approach in areas other than simply anti-corruption?
I do. I think you raise a good point. I mean, I don't know if it's quite as advanced because there's such government focus and the fines and the penalties have been so significant in the FCPA arena. You've got real international attention. It's funny, I was just in Sweden a couple of weeks ago and advising a company, and Sweden right now is having their own version of their version of Enron, where huge telecom company is
Right.
under investigation. I think you're aware of that case, and I think it doesn't get as much play here in the U.S., but it's a huge deal over there, and I think everyone's watching it really closely. And so you've got real focus throughout the world on anti-corruption, but you also have the focus on sanctions. I find almost equally as emphatic is how companies are worried about the different embargoes, the sanction program, OFAC. So you've got a lot of companies that are very concerned with those issues in those cases, and you've seen obviously some of the big penalties that come out of the financial sanctions, the BNP case and others, where companies and financial institutions are seeing these huge penalties are being applied, and so you've got a lot of concern over sanctions. I do see also, as you mentioned, the human trafficking issue. It's starting to take a greater hold and reach the attention of the compliance folks. But I still think the FCPA, the anti-corruption, and the sanctions issues are still way out in front. But I think it's as you rightly point out. I think it's compliance folks, the business folks really need to be concerned on the whole host of these international issues. We live in such a different world now, where international commerce is so much more the norm. Crossing boundaries and borders is so much more routine, and I think these issues are likewise are more prominent now for the corporate, the C-suite and the compliance folks. There's a lot of different issues that now need to be addressed, not just anti-corruption, as you rightly point out.
And maybe even to bring it up to events in Paris over the last few days and last week, I think that one of the responses is going to be a tightening of money laundering rules, regulations, and regimes around corporations. I think obviously banks have faced this issue, and you mentioned a couple that have paid large fines in that area, but that's something that really corporate America has not focused on. And I think that may be one of the outcomes for the corporate world and our clients really out of what we saw in Paris last week.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and without question, I think that is going to be one of the responses. And AML, is absolutely a huge issue, only to get more important. I think you're right. You're going to see more regulations. I think FinCEN and FINRA, they're going to extend AML requirements to the broker dealers. So you're only going to see more regulation, more tightening, more scrutiny on those issues. Without question, I think you're absolutely right. I think in the case, the situation in Mali really hit home for me too, because in our investigations, I stayed in that hotel in the Radisson several times up until last year, and to watch those events unfold, it's really chilling. And I think it's this kind of thing is. I don't think there's any end in sight, and I think, as you say, correctly, I think the ramifications are going to be profound and going to extend, to many different areas, and certainly AML is, going to be an issue not just for the banks, but certainly for companies as well. And as you see, like trade-based money laundering, and as you see money laundering activity get more sophisticated, and it's going to extend out from financial institutions to, using corporations and actual, purchase and sale transactions and other kinds of asset-based transactions as a money laundering vehicle. Law enforcement is going to, and others, in Congress and other countries are going to hone in on that and really focus, and it's going to heighten the layer or the level of responsibility for companies to also take part in those efforts too. No question.
Bob, you and I could probably continue on for quite a while, but unfortunately we're near the end of our time. But I was wondering, if anyone wanted to follow up with you, could they email you? And if so, how could they do it?
Absolutely. My email is Appleton, my last name, rappleton @daypitney.com, DAYPITNEY.com. Happy to take any emails and thoughts, anything else. I really appreciate your bringing me on, Tom.
Well, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks very much.
Definitely. Absolutely. My pleasure.
Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox again, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I'm putting together a list of questions for my next mailbag episode, and I'd love to be able to talk about your question on a podcast. So if you have any questions, please email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if I could ask you to go to iTunes and rate this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. Once again, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening and look forward to visiting with you again. Thank you.